courage, and it was a warm, quiet afternoon in the city. The kind of afternoon where everything seems calm and people move about their day without rushing. Lila, a young blind girl, was walking home from her music class. She loved music more than anything else. It was her way of feeling the world around her, sensing colors and emotions through the vibrations of the notes. She carried her small backpack, her white cane tapping steadily against the pavement, guiding her through familiar streets. Even though she couldn't see, she had learned to understand the city through sounds, smells, and the feel of the ground beneath her feet. Most people in the neighborhood knew Lila. They had watched her grow up, and they admired her independence. Some would stop and greet her, offer a few words of encouragement, or simply smile. Lila had learned to recognize people by their voices, the rhythm of their steps, or even the subtle way they laughed. But that afternoon, something felt off. She couldn't place it at first. There was a low rumble that didn't belong, the sound of a police cruiser slowing down nearby. It was different from the usual city hum, heavier, colder somehow. Inside the car, Officer Harris noticed her immediately. He had been driving around aimlessly, looking for reasons to feel powerful, to assert control over anyone who crossed his path. When he saw Lila, he sneered. There was something cruel in his eyes, something that didn't belong in someone sworn to protect the public. He muttered under his breath something derogatory about her, something that made no sense other than to satisfy his own bitterness. Lila didn't notice him at first. She was focused on her steps, on the familiar sounds of the street, the distant barking of a dog, the wind brushing against the trees, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. But the atmosphere shifted quickly. Harris got out of the car. His boots hit the pavement with an intentional loudness, announcing his presence. Lila paused, her senses alerting her that something was wrong. She could feel the tension in the air before she could understand what it was. She tried to move past him, but Harris didn't just step aside. Instead, he deliberately stepped closer, blocking her path. "Hey, watch where you're going," he said, though it wasn't a warning. It was meant to intimidate. Lila felt a pang of fear, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your heart race. She had encountered rude people before, but something about this moment was different. Something about the cruelty in Harris's tone made her step back cautiously, trying to avoid confrontation. Unbeknownst to Harris, the street was not entirely empty. A small crowd had gathered nearby for a charity event. They were setting up tables and decorations, planning a day of fun and giving. Among them were two people no one expected to see in a quiet city street on a regular afternoon: Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and John Cena. They were volunteering at the event, helping with the setup, laughing with children, and encouraging the community to participate. They had no idea that their presence would soon turn a frightening moment into something extraordinary. From where they stood, they noticed the sudden tension near the street. The energy in the air had changed. The Rock paused mid-step, his brow furrowing as he listened. John Cena, always attentive, noticed the same shift. Something wasn't right. They could sense that someone vulnerable was being threatened, even before they could see the details. They exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were about to witness something that no one would forget. Then it happened. Harris moved closer to Lila. He didn't just intimidate her. He shoved her slightly, enough to make her stumble. The white cane bounced against the pavement as she tried to regain her balance. Lila's heart raced. She had been careful, cautious, doing everything she could to navigate the world safely. But this encounter felt like a violation of everything she relied on. People gasped, some stepping forward instinctively. Lila's parents, who lived a few blocks away, were still at home, unaware of the danger their daughter faced. The Rock was the first to react. He walked calmly but with authority toward the scene. There was no shouting, no aggressive movements, just a presence that commanded respect. "Hey," he called out firmly. "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. The crowd paused, frozen, because everyone recognized the seriousness in his tone. Even Harris, who had been brimming with arrogance, felt the weight of it. He didn't know who this man was yet, but the confidence and authority radiating from him made it clear that he wasn't dealing with a typical bystander. John Cena joined immediately. Placing himself beside the Rock, he knelt slightly to check on Lila. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. His tone was calm and reassuring, designed to soothe rather than intimidate. Lila's heart, still racing from the shove, began to steady. The fear didn't disappear instantly, but the presence of someone who genuinely cared gave her strength. She nodded slightly, gripping her cane tighter. She could feel the protection, the solidarity forming around her. Harris, on the other hand, was now in a state of confusion. He had expected compliance, fear, maybe even silence, but not this. He had underestimated the situation entirely. The crowd, noticing the interaction, started taking out their phones. Cameras clicked, capturing every detail. It was no longer just a private act of cruelty. It was a public moment. Harris's words faltered. He tried to defend himself, stammering, but the words didn't carry the authority he wanted. The Rock stepped closer, not threatening, but firm. "You don't just push someone like that," he said. The calmness in his voice made the officer's anger seem petty, almost ridiculous. John Cena continued to reassure Lila, holding her hand lightly to guide her away from the path of danger. She felt a small spark of hope amidst the fear. For the first time that afternoon, she realized that she wasn't alone, that there were people willing to step in when someone needed help. The crowd around them grew. Neighbors came out of nearby shops, curious about the commotion. The collective presence of people, the attention from both ordinary citizens and celebrities, made it impossible for Harris to continue his aggression without consequence. Lila's fear slowly transformed into determination. She could feel that the moment was bigger than just her, that this encounter would matter, that it could change something. Harris, realizing that he was being watched, attempted one last time to regain control. He straightened his posture, trying to appear authoritative, but his efforts were futile. The cameras recorded every flinch, every hesitation. Lila, though shaken, stood her ground with The Rock and John Cena protecting her. The strength in their presence was more powerful than fear itself. By the time Lila's parents arrived, alerted by neighbors who had witnessed the incident, Harris had no choice but to step back. The Rock and John Cena stayed close to Lila, reassuring her, helping her navigate to safety. The crowd applauded quietly, a mixture of relief and admiration. Lila's parents hugged her tightly, tears welling up in their eyes. They were scared, yes, but overwhelmingly grateful that their daughter was unharmed and surrounded by people who cared. Even after the incident ended, the sound of Lila's cane tapping against the pavement felt different. The city that had seemed quiet and ordinary now felt alive, connected in a way she had never noticed before. She realized that while danger existed, kindness and courage were never far behind, and sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, like two strangers who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Compassion can appear when it is needed most. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Lila was still gripping her white cane, her heart pounding from the earlier shove. She could feel the adrenaline running through her, a mix of fear, confusion, and relief. Relief because two strangers, giants of courage and kindness, were standing by her side. Their presence gave her a sense of protection she hadn't felt before. The Rock's eyes never left Officer Harris. He spoke again, his voice calm but unwavering. "You can't just treat people like that, especially someone who can't even defend herself." His tone didn't carry anger in the way Harris expected. Instead, it carried the weight of truth, a quiet authority that made the officer falter. Harris's face twisted with a mixture of surprise and irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not in front of witnesses and certainly not by someone who radiated such confidence. John Cena, kneeling beside Lila, gently adjusted her grip on the cane. "You're safe now," he said softly. His words were meant to reassure, to let her know that the danger had not passed without notice. "We won't let anyone hurt you." Lila's fingers trembled slightly around the cane, but hearing him speak made her feel braver. It was more than just comfort, it was a shield, a promise that someone would stand between her and harm. Harris tried to recover. He straightened his uniform, trying to regain the authority he believed he had. "I'm a police officer," he said, his voice a mixture of irritation and defensiveness. "I can handle this," but his words had no impact. The cameras, the crowd, and the calm yet commanding presence of The Rock and John Cena made it clear that his actions were under scrutiny. This was no longer about authority. It was about accountability. The Rock stepped closer, keeping a respectful but firm distance from Harris. "Being a police officer doesn't give you the right to hurt people," he said, "especially not someone who's vulnerable and can't see what's happening." The crowd murmured in agreement. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of the encounter. Harris could feel the pressure mounting. He had been caught, not just by two men who seemed to have a presence larger than life, but by the community that had gathered. Lila, though still shaken, felt something shift inside her. Fear was slowly being replaced by courage. She realized that the world was bigger than her blindness, that the kindness and bravery of strangers could make a real difference. She trusted the Rock and John Cena, not just because of who they were, but because their actions spoke louder than words. They weren't here for fame or attention. They were here to help someone who couldn't defend herself. Harris took a step back, visibly frustrated. He wasn't used to being questioned so openly, especially by people who didn't fear him. The Rock maintained eye contact, unwavering. John Cena continued to stay close to Lila, offering silent support, his presence a shield between her and the officer. Lila felt her confidence returning in small increments. She took a careful step forward, guided by Cena's reassuring hand. "Are you okay to walk?" John Cena asked gently, sensing her hesitation. Lila nodded, her voice barely audible but steady. "Yes, I think so." He smiled at her, a small gesture that meant more than words could convey. The crowd watched silently, captivated by the unfolding scene. They could sense the shift from fear to empowerment, from vulnerability to protection. Harris tried one last time to assert control. "Step back," he barked, pointing at the crowd. But the crowd didn't step back. Instead, they moved slightly closer, subtly creating a circle around Lila and the two men protecting her. Their presence was a silent message. This would not be ignored. The officer realized that the entire situation had turned against him. Every move he made was being watched, judged, and recorded. The Rock didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. He simply stated the truth. "You don't scare anyone here. What matters is that she's safe, and that's what we're going to make sure of." The calm, firm tone carried a weight that Harris could not deny. It wasn't anger, it was integrity, the kind that couldn't be challenged by intimidation or status. Meanwhile, Lila's surroundings felt different. The usual city noises, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people, now seemed like a comforting background. She could hear the soft click of cameras, the murmur of the crowd, the steady footsteps of her protectors. She realized that she wasn't just safe, she was seen. Her vulnerability wasn't a weakness here. It was something the community had collectively decided to protect. The Rock glanced at John Cena and nodded slightly. They had both understood what needed to happen next. Cena continued to guide Lila, keeping her close but allowing her space to move independently. The Rock turned back to Harris, his expression calm but unwavering. "You need to apologize, not just to her, but to everyone watching. Actions like that aren't acceptable anywhere, anytime." Harris's face reddened. Pride and arrogance had been his armor, but now it felt brittle and useless. The weight of the witnesses, the cameras, and the two men standing firmly in front of him made it impossible to maintain his facade. He muttered something under his breath, a half-hearted excuse that didn't carry conviction. The crowd grew louder, urging him to take responsibility. At that moment, a few neighbors stepped closer, speaking up. "Leave her alone," one said. "You have no right to treat her that way." Another added, "She's just a child. You can't push her around." Their voices blended with the murmurs of the crowd, creating a chorus that reinforced the Rock and Cena's stance. Lila felt a strange mixture of awe and gratitude. She couldn't see them, but she could feel the strength of the community surrounding her. John Cena crouched slightly to make eye contact with her, speaking softly. "We're not going anywhere. You're okay. We've got you." His words were simple yet powerful. Lila's breathing slowed as she realized she could trust these strangers entirely. For the first time that afternoon, she felt a sense of relief that went beyond physical safety. It was emotional. She was not alone in this world, even when facing danger. Harris, realizing the futility of his actions, finally took a small step back. The Rock didn't move closer or threaten him further. Instead, he simply held his gaze, silent but firm. The unspoken message was clear. The officer had made a choice, and now he would have to face the consequences. The presence of witnesses, the community, and two public figures ensured that his behavior would not be ignored. Lila's breathing steadied further. The adrenaline that had filled her body slowly ebbed, replaced by a cautious sense of calm. She could feel her confidence growing in small increments, bolstered by the silent support of those around her. The crowd began to disperse slightly, but many stayed to ensure she was safe. Neighbors spoke to her in gentle tones, offering kind words and encouragement. The Rock finally spoke again, his voice carrying warmth alongside authority. "You're safe now. Nothing's going to happen to you." Lila could feel the sincerity in his words, and it was more reassuring than anything else she had heard that day. John Cena stayed beside her, guiding her with patience and care. She realized that heroism wasn't always loud or dramatic. It could be calm, deliberate, and protective. As Lila continued to walk, guided by Cena and supported by the community, the sense of fear that had gripped her earlier began to fade completely. She understood something important. Vulnerability was not weakness. Courage could come in many forms, and sometimes it appeared as the calm presence of someone willing to stand by you when danger threatened. Even Harris, though still fuming internally, had to accept the reality of the situation. The cameras, the crowd, and the unmistakable authority of The Rock and John Cena meant that there was no escaping accountability. Actions had consequences, and this was one he could not deny. For Lila, the day had shifted from one of fear to one of understanding. She realized that while the world could be cruel at times, there were also those who would step in without hesitation to protect others. It was a lesson in trust, courage, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. As she moved forward, guided by hands she trusted and supported by a community she could feel, she carried with her a newfound strength, a belief that even in difficult moments, she would not be alone. After the incident on the street, the news spread faster than anyone expected. A neighbor had uploaded the video online, capturing the moment Lila was threatened, The Rock and John Cena stepping in, and the officer being forced to back down. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared on social media, talked about on news sites, and discussed in group chats. People from across the city and even the country were shocked and moved. Most were outraged at the behavior of the officer, but even more were inspired by the courage and presence of The Rock and John Cena. Back at home, Lila's parents were still processing the day. Their daughter had walked home safely, guided and protected by strangers who had stepped in at the exact right moment. They were still shaken by the thought of what could have happened, but relief flooded through them. Their small living room felt fuller than usual as they watched the video online, seeing their daughter standing tall despite everything. Her fingers still gripped the white cane, but her posture spoke volumes. Even blind, she had faced fear and come through it with support from people who genuinely cared. The Rock and John Cena didn't stop with just helping Lila that afternoon. They both went to local media outlets and shared their perspective on what had happened. They emphasized that courage wasn't just about fame or strength, but about stepping in when someone needed help. They highlighted the importance of empathy, of protecting those who are vulnerable and standing against cruelty wherever it appears. Their words resonated with millions of people who saw the video online. Messages of support poured in for Lila, from people she would never meet, praising her bravery and thanking her protectors for their courage. Meanwhile, Officer Harris found himself under intense scrutiny. His actions were being examined not just by the public but by the department itself. The footage made it impossible for him to deny what had happened. Witnesses gave their accounts explaining how the officer had intentionally harassed a blind girl and how The Rock and John Cena had intervened. Internal investigations were launched, and colleagues who had ignored similar behavior in the past began to realize the weight of accountability. Harris was facing consequences he had never imagined, and for the first time, the authority he had relied on to intimidate others felt fragile. For Lila, the attention was overwhelming but also strangely empowering. She could feel the shift in the world around her. People were talking about her, yes, but more importantly, they were talking about what it meant to stand up for others. She began to realize that even though she couldn't see, she could inspire people with her story. She became aware of the impact that small acts of courage could have. Her life, once just ordinary and predictable, was now a symbol of resilience and hope. At school the next day, her classmates and teachers greeted her with a mix of concern and admiration. Some had seen the video online, while others had heard the story through the grapevine. They treated her differently, not with pity but with respect. Even her teachers, who had always been kind, seemed to see her with new eyes. They realized that bravery comes in many forms, and that Lila had experienced a moment of fear that she had turned into strength with the support of others. The Rock and John Cena continued to use the incident as an example of why community matters. They partnered with local organizations to start programs teaching empathy and respect, especially toward people with disabilities. They spoke at schools, community centers, and public events about standing up for others, making it clear that heroism doesn't always require fame. It can be as simple as noticing someone in need and choosing to act. Lila's story became central to these efforts, though she remained modest about her experience. She never thought of herself as a hero. She just wanted to be safe. The city itself began to change, quietly but noticeably. Local authorities started sensitivity and empathy training for officers. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to protect vulnerable citizens. People started paying more attention to each other, checking in with neighbors and creating a safer, more supportive environment. The actions of a few individuals, Harris, The Rock, Cena, and the bystanders that day, had created a ripple effect that reached far beyond the street where it all began. Lila, meanwhile, returned to her music with a new sense of purpose. Every note she played felt infused with meaning. Music had always been her way of understanding the world, but now it also became a way to express her strength and resilience. She often played at community events, sometimes with The Rock or John Cena attending, showing their continued support. People would gather to listen, not just for the music but to witness the young girl whose courage had inspired so many. Even though the attention was positive, Lila's parents remained cautious. They didn't want her life to be overwhelmed by fame or media coverage, but they couldn't ignore the impact the story had on the community. Strangers were sending gifts, letters, and messages of encouragement. Schools were talking about her bravery in classes. People who had once felt powerless themselves felt empowered after seeing how the courage of a few could protect someone vulnerable. Officer Harris, facing public backlash and internal investigations, began to experience the consequences of his actions in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was forced to confront the reality that abuse of power has limits, especially when the community, witnesses, and even strangers refused to stay silent. His attempts at justification fell flat. He had misjudged the situation, misjudged the courage of the people around him, and most importantly, he had misjudged Lila herself. Even though she was blind and vulnerable, she had a strength that could not be ignored. As weeks passed, the video continued to circulate, sparking conversations across social media platforms, talk shows, and community forums. Lila, who had never imagined herself in such a spotlight, began to receive letters from young people who had been inspired by her story. Many of them shared their own experiences of fear or bullying, and how seeing someone protected by others gave them hope. The Rock and Cena often shared these letters, emphasizing the message of empathy, courage, and standing up for what is right. For Lila, life slowly returned to a rhythm of normalcy. She went to school, attended her music classes, and played with her friends. Yet the lessons of that day stayed with her. She learned that fear can be faced with help, and that kindness and courage are never wasted. She understood that even ordinary people could become heroes, simply by stepping in when someone else is in danger. The experience didn't make her reckless, but it made her more aware, more confident, and more compassionate. The story of Lila, The Rock, and John Cena became more than just a viral moment. It became a movement. It reminded people that the world could be cruel, but it could also be filled with protectors, witnesses, and allies ready to step in. It inspired communities to be more vigilant, more caring, and more willing to intervene when someone is vulnerable. Lila's life, once ordinary and quiet, had transformed into a story of resilience, courage, and hope. Even years later, people would remember the day when a young blind girl was threatened, and two strangers, famous, strong, and compassionate, stood beside her to protect her. They would remember the crowd that formed around her, the cameras that captured the truth, and the lesson that courage comes in many forms. For Lila, the lesson was personal. The world could be scary, but there were always people willing to make it safe. And sometimes those people could appear when you least expect them, ready to change the course of your life with their presence, their words, and their actions. Life in the city began to shift quietly after the incident. People started noticing small changes in the way neighbors treated each other, in the way children played in the streets, and in the way the community talked about respect and empathy. The story of Lila, the blind girl and how the Rock and John Cena had stepped in to protect her, had left a lasting impression. For many, it was more than a story. It was a lesson in courage, responsibility, and humanity. Lila's daily routine returned to its familiar rhythm. She went to school, attended her music classes, and spent time with friends. But she carried with her a new sense of confidence. She no longer felt the same vulnerability she once did when walking alone. The experience had taught her that, while danger could appear unexpectedly, there were people willing to step in and stand beside her. That knowledge gave her strength. Her music became more than just a hobby. Every time she played, she felt a connection not only to the notes but to the experience she had endured. The songs she practiced carried emotion, resilience, and determination. Friends and teachers noticed a difference in her performances. There was a depth in her music now, a reflection of her journey through fear and courage. Her story inspired others, and she became a quiet symbol of bravery in her school and neighborhood. The Rock and John Cena continued to visit the city occasionally, participating in community events and speaking to children and adults alike about empathy and protection. Their involvement wasn't about fame, it was about teaching real values. They often spoke directly about the importance of standing up when someone is in danger, using Lila's experience as a clear, tangible example. Children listened, fascinated not just by the celebrity figures but by the lessons they represented: courage, compassion, and integrity. Meanwhile, Officer Harris faced the consequences of his actions. The public attention and media coverage made it impossible for the department to ignore the situation. Internal investigations were carried out, and he was suspended while the review took place. The incident became a case study for the city's police department, highlighting the importance of training in sensitivity, empathy, and accountability. Harris had learned, perhaps too late, that authority does not justify cruelty. The community also became more proactive. Neighborhood meetings were held, discussing ways to ensure that vulnerable members of the community, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities, felt safe. Parents shared stories and strategies, while schools began incorporating lessons on empathy and inclusion. The incident sparked a conversation that went beyond just Lila's story. It became a catalyst for creating a more caring, watchful, and protective environment. Lila herself began to understand the larger impact of what had happened. She wasn't just a victim who had been protected. She was someone who inspired others. Letters and messages poured in from people who had watched the video or read about the event online. Some were from children who said they had learned to be more courageous. Others were from adults who admitted they hadn't always stood up for the vulnerable and were now determined to do better. Each message reminded Lila that her experience had meaning far beyond herself. Her parents remained cautious, protective, and quietly proud. They encouraged her to continue her music and her studies, while helping her understand the responsibility that came with her newfound recognition. They explained that while it was wonderful to inspire others, it was also important to remain grounded, to be kind, and to make thoughtful decisions. Lila listened carefully, understanding that courage also meant being humble and aware of one's influence. The Rock and John Cena maintained contact, not in a public attention-seeking way but through private support. They occasionally visited, checked on her progress in school and music, and encouraged her to continue sharing her story in ways that could help others. Their presence, even when not physically nearby, provided a sense of security. Lila knew that people who cared about her well-being existed in the world, and that their example of bravery was something she could carry with her forever. In school, teachers introduced new programs inspired by the incident. Children were encouraged to recognize when someone needed help, to speak up against cruelty, and to support classmates facing difficulties. These lessons were reinforced through stories, activities, and role-playing exercises, helping students internalize the importance of empathy. Lila participated occasionally, sharing her perspective as someone who had experienced fear and courage firsthand. Her voice, once quiet, now carried authority because it was backed by lived experience. Meanwhile, the city's law enforcement agencies recognized the need for change. Sensitivity and empathy training became mandatory, and officers were taught to understand the experiences of vulnerable citizens, particularly those with disabilities. The story of Lila's encounter with Harris became a reference point for discussions on ethics, behavior, and accountability. The city realized that small acts of negligence could have devastating effects, and that vigilance, compassion, and professionalism were essential for public trust. As months passed, Lila began performing at community events, sometimes with The Rock or John Cena attending to support local initiatives. She was no longer just a student of music. She had become a young ambassador for courage and empathy. Her performances were moving not only because of the music, but because of the story behind her. People listened and felt inspired by the journey she had been through, understanding that strength and bravery could come in all shapes and forms. Even ordinary residents began taking action. People watched over their neighborhoods more attentively, helped children and neighbors in small ways, and intervened when they saw someone being mistreated. The ripple effect of that afternoon grew beyond Lila's immediate story. Courage, once seen as something rare or dramatic, became a shared responsibility. The city, once ordinary and quiet, had become more connected, compassionate, and resilient. For Lila, life was not without its challenges. She still faced moments of fear, as anyone does, but she now had the confidence to navigate them. She knew she could ask for help, trust others, and stand tall even when the world seemed uncertain. Every step she took, guided by her cane, was now also guided by an understanding of courage and community support. She realized that vulnerability didn't mean weakness, it meant the opportunity for others to show their strength and kindness. Her parents noticed this change in her daily life. They saw her become more assertive, more confident, and more aware of the people around her. They saw her engage with friends, teachers, and neighbors in ways that reflected her new perspective on courage and empathy. They felt proud, not just because she had been protected, but because she had grown stronger, wiser, and more compassionate through the experience. Even years later, the memory of that afternoon remained vivid. Lila remembered the fear, the sudden threat, and the presence of two strangers who had changed the course of her life. She remembered the crowd, the cameras, and the overwhelming feeling of being seen and protected. And she remembered the lesson she had learned, that courage, empathy, and kindness are not abstract ideas, they are actions, choices, and responsibilities. The Rock and John Cena remained part of that memory, not as celebrities but as symbols of courage and action. They had shown that standing up for someone, especially someone vulnerable, is always the right choice. And for Lila, that lesson became personal. She carried it with her every day, in the way she walked, in the way she played her music, and in the way she treated others. The city, forever changed in subtle ways, became a place where empathy was valued, courage was encouraged, and ordinary people realized that they could make a difference. Lila's story was a reminder that even a small act of support could grow into something much larger than anyone could anticipate. What began as a frightening encounter had blossomed into a narrative of hope, resilience, and community. And for Lila, every step she took after that day was more than just movement. It was proof that bravery exists in the quiet moments, that kindness can change lives, and that sometimes the world shows its best side when it stands together to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Years had passed since that warm afternoon when Lila had been threatened on the street. The memory of the fear she had felt never fully disappeared, but it no longer held power over her. Instead, it had been transformed into a source of strength, courage, and purpose. Lila had grown into a young woman with a quiet confidence. She moved through the world with care, awareness, and compassion, never forgetting the lesson she had learned so early in life, that bravery and kindness can appear in the most unexpected ways, and that ordinary people have the power to protect and inspire others. The story of that day had remained alive in the city, in the community, and in the hearts of people who had witnessed it. For Lila, the presence of The Rock and John Cena had been transformative. They had not only protected her in a moment of danger, but they had also taught her that heroism is about action, integrity, and empathy. Their ongoing support, through letters, visits, and encouragement, reminded her that there are always people willing to step up when someone is in need. Lila's passion for music had grown alongside her sense of purpose. She often performed at community events, local schools, and charity gatherings. Each performance carried more than just melody. It carried emotion, resilience, and the story of someone who had faced fear and found courage. Parents, teachers, and children would gather to listen, inspired not only by the music but also by the journey behind it. Lila had become a symbol of hope for many, a reminder that even in moments of vulnerability, strength and kindness could prevail. Her parents watched with pride and quiet relief. They had always known Lila was strong, but the events of that day and the years that followed had shown them just how remarkable their daughter was. They were proud not only of her courage but also of her empathy. Lila had learned to extend kindness to others, to speak out when someone was in danger, and to support those who could not defend themselves. Her parents often reminded her that her story could inspire many more people if shared thoughtfully, and she took that responsibility seriously. Even the city itself had changed in small but meaningful ways. Programs teaching empathy, inclusion, and community responsibility had become part of school curriculums. Neighborhoods were more watchful, more supportive, and more connected. The incident with Officer Harris had sparked a conversation about accountability, and the ripple effect of one brave intervention had grown into a lasting movement. People who had once felt powerless now realized that standing up for others could make a real difference. Lila's own perspective on the world had shifted dramatically. She understood now that life could be unpredictable, that danger could appear suddenly, and that people could surprise you with both cruelty and kindness. She had learned to trust her instincts, to seek support when needed, and to act with courage even in small ways. Each step she took in her daily life carried the lessons of that afternoon: awareness, empathy, and resilience. The Rock and John Cena had remained a subtle but important part of her life. Their visits, encouragement, and mentorship were never about attention or recognition. They were about guidance and support. They helped Lila understand that courage is not about being fearless. It is about acting despite fear. They reminded her that her experience had value beyond herself, and that her story could teach others the importance of standing up for the vulnerable. Lila carried their advice in her heart, using it to navigate challenges, inspire others, and grow stronger every day. Her story had also reached far beyond her city. Messages from strangers, young and old, poured in from across the country. Many shared their own experiences with fear, bullying, or vulnerability, and expressed gratitude for the courage shown by Lila and her protectors. Some said that the story had inspired them to intervene in situations where they might have stayed silent before. Others were simply moved by the idea that two strangers had stepped up to protect someone in need. Lila, though humbled, realized that her story had become a beacon for courage and empathy. Even in moments of quiet, Lila reflected on the lessons she had learned. Fear is a part of life, she understood, but so is the potential for kindness. Vulnerability is not a weakness, she realized, but an opportunity for others to show their strength. She carried this awareness into her interactions with others, offering help when she could, speaking up when she saw injustice, and supporting friends, classmates, and strangers alike. Her experiences had given her a unique perspective on courage, responsibility, and the power of community. Officer Harris, meanwhile, had faded from public attention, but the consequences of his actions remained a cautionary tale. His suspension and the investigation had made it clear that abuse of power comes at a cost. The community had learned a valuable lesson about accountability, and the city had grown stronger because of it. Lila, though never seeking revenge or recognition, understood that justice could be served in ways that restored balance and encouraged better behavior. Over time, Lila began to speak publicly about her experience. Not to relive the fear, but to teach others about courage, empathy, and the power of standing up for someone in need. She visited schools, community centers, and youth programs, sharing her story in a way that was relatable and inspiring. She emphasized that heroism doesn't always require fame, strength, or recognition. Sometimes it's simply noticing someone in trouble and choosing to act. Each time she spoke, she felt a quiet pride not in herself alone, but in the people who had supported her, protected her, and inspired her to believe in the goodness of others. She spoke of The Rock and John Cena, not as celebrities but as examples of courage and action. Their intervention had not only saved her in that moment, but it had also shaped the path of her life, teaching her about integrity, compassion, and the importance of using one's influence for good. Lila's music continued to flourish,